I'm Jerry Bass, pastor of the United Methodist Church in St. Thomas, North Dakota, and I would like to welcome you to this third and final video for UMC 101, a course designed to provide new members with information about our denomination and to offer a refresher for persons who may be lifelong Methodists. The first two segments of the class were devoted to the topics of history and beliefs, while this final portion will focus on the organization of the church. Included in this video is information about clergy and laity roles, how the church is organized and governed at the various levels from local to global, and the recommended and alternate structures for the local churches. We'll begin by talking about the various roles of laypersons and members of the clergy. A long-standing tradition of the Methodist movement has been respect for the role of the laity. While we'll talk a bit later about such gatherings as annual, jurisdictional, and general conferences, let me say at this point that the delegations for each of those meetings are comprised of equal numbers of laypersons and clergy. And obviously at the local level, almost all offices are held by members of the church, with the pastor expected to participate in all or almost all of the governance process. United Methodist laity often play critical roles in many of the programs and ministries of the local church, including services, Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, musicians, and participants in a variety of mission and other programming activities. Trained lay speakers often are asked to lead worship in the absence of a member of the clergy. And a special role anticipated for laity is the cultivation of future clergy. By their observant recognition of such promise in persons young and old, their encouragement and consideration of calls by God to ministry, and their continued support of persons going through the candidacy process preparatory to ordination or licensing. Speaking of those last terms, let me note that pastors in the United Methodist Church fall into two categories: licensed local pastors and elders. They differ primarily in the expectations for education and itinerancy, but both are found to have been called by God for such service as they are examined and counseled and mentored through lengthy processes of preparation. To become a licensed local pastor, an individual begins with a sense of call, often shared with one or more pastors. The district superintendent gets involved and provides guidance through the process of candidacy, as does a clergy mentor and the district committee on ordained ministry. An early obligation for a person seeking to be an LLP, the shorthand for licensed local pastor, is licensing school, typically the equivalent of a 2-week basic training in pastoral skills and activities. With brief exposure to such topics as preaching, teaching, pastoral care, and leadership in the local church, the candidate then becomes eligible for appointment as a licensed local pastor. Appointment by the bishop to a local church or charge. Now, charge is simply a term that may include a pastor serving more than one congregation, as we would say in a 2-point charge or a 3-point charge. Once appointed as an LLP, either on a full-time or often a part-time basis, the pastor then is expected to continue an educational process known as a course of study, typically attending classes at a United Methodist seminary or other location 2 to 4 weeks each year, a very different educational expectation than the seminary training required for an elder. Another difference between an LLP and an elder has to do with itinerancy, a term used in the United Methodist Church to define an elder's obligation to serve wherever the bishop determines, as well as an expectation that there will be a continuing appointment in some location as long as the clergy member remains in good standing. So the local pastor's appointment normally does not include required moves, nor does it imply an expectation of continued employment beyond the year of appointment. Now, at one time, licensed local pastors were few and far between, especially in our area. But now, there often are more LLPs than elders in a given region. This year, for example, I'm one of only 4 elders in the entire northeastern part of North Dakota. And while the appointment of local pastors is for 1 year at a time, many serve their congregations for years. For example, Gary Johnson, a retired teacher and farmer in Humboldt, Minnesota, has served congregations in this region, including St. Thomas, for well over a decade, as has Raynell Sorensen down in Larimore in our villa. The second category of clergy, those said to be on the elder track, differs from local pastors, in some ways already noted. While the exploratory period of sensing a call to ministry may be very similar, the pursuit of that call varies considerably. The person seeking to become an elder must complete an undergraduate degree, followed by a Master of Divinity degree from an approved seminary. Following graduation, the individual begins a probationary period as a provisional elder, having been commissioned to do so by the bishop. Under the supervision of the Conference Board of Ordained Ministry, a district superintendent, and a mentor, the provisional elder continues training, provided several weeks each year, while typically serving as a pastor or associate pastor in one of the conference churches. Following a rigorous and continuing process of examination, after completion of the 2 or 3 year probationary period, the candidate then may be ordained by the bishop as an elder in the church. I've already mentioned district superintendents a couple of times and should note now that such persons serve in supervisory and managerial roles, assisting a bishop in overseeing a regional collection of pastors and churches. All the district superintendents must be ordained elders with considerable experience in local churches. And I'll talk a bit more about their role later. The final clergy-related role in the United Methodist Church is that of a bishop. Persons who almost always have had extensive service as pastors, as well as roles as a conference and sometimes general church levels. In the United Methodist Church, a bishop must be an ordained elder and is elected to such a position, maintaining that status for the rest of his or her life, as long as they are in good standing in the church. And as with district superintendents, I'll talk a bit more about the selection and role of bishops later in this video. And so we have 2 tracks to pastoral appointments in the United Methodist Church, that of licensed local pastors and that of elders. One might wonder how all of the rules and regulations that guide the processes for becoming members of the clergy are maintained, along with all the other details of running a large corporation. The answer lies in the Book of Discipline, a lengthy publication, hundreds of pages, that is revised every 4 years and contains the governing principles, the rules and regs of the church for everything from the job of the trustees of a local church to how to conduct a baptism, from the procedures for buying or selling church property to the conduct of a complaint lodged against a pastor. If you really wanted to examine the Book of Discipline, you can usually find a copy in your local church office, or you can find an online version offered by Cokesbury, a Methodist-related publishing and merchandising operation. Just Google it. But I hesitate to recommend such effort unless you have a truly burning question for which the answer could only be in that book. For a reader can quickly become bogged down in the minutiae of management, given the size and complexity of our denomination. And how big, you might ask? Well, the most recent statistics which I have seen indicate that UMC membership worldwide totals about 13 million, with about half in the United States and the remainder overseas, primarily in Africa and Asia, with small numbers in Europe and South America. Now, that seems like a lot, but you have to realize that at one time membership just in the United States exceeded 10 million persons. The decline in American membership has been more than offset by growth in the Southern Hemisphere. And beyond the membership numbers, you can see the comprehensive nature of church management by the fact that there are approximately 31,000 congregations just in the United States, and that a recent annual budget showed over $6 billion in money raised by the church for its operations and its ministries. So you can see why a comprehensive document such as the Book of Discipline is a necessity for the efficient and effective administration of our denomination. Let me turn now to another subject of organization, the concept of conferences. Since the days of John Wesley, Francis Asbury, and Thomas Coke, Methodists have been organized by groups known as conferences. Today, church governance takes place at 4 levels of conference structures, from the local congregation to the global church. At the top level of governance is the General Conference, a body which has ultimate authority on all things United Methodist. The regular meeting of the General Conference is held every 4 years, with anywhere from 600 to 1,000 delegates traveling to a central location for nearly 2 weeks of meetings. Divided equally between clergy and laity, the General Conference delegates are chosen at annual conferences throughout the world. We are in the midst of a most unusual situation, though, since the regularly scheduled General Conference that was supposed to meet in Minneapolis last spring in 2020 was postponed due to the rising pandemic that began just months before it was to be convened. The deferred gathering is now scheduled for Minneapolis in August, but concerns about the ability and safety of persons to travel from around the world remains a concern, and there's talk that the General Conference could be delayed even further or somehow reorganized around regional groupings or even convened virtually. But whenever and however the General Conference is convened, it will again constitute the ultimate authority under God for the operation and administration of our denomination. Almost every detail in the Book of Discipline is open to the possibility of revision at such a gathering, which not only considers every aspect of church policy, but adopts budgets for the following quadrennium and oversees the operation of large church agencies that oversee everything from finances to higher education, from ministry to missions. It's interesting to note that while bishops take turns chairing sessions of the General Conference, they have no vote on any matters to come before the body. And the entire group of bishops, known as the College of Bishops, have no general authority over the conference, or the global church for that matter, other than the influence they may exert from their leadership roles. And then, usually several weeks following the conclusion of each General Conference, those delegates and their alternates meet in regional groupings as jurisdictional conferences. There are two primary tasks in those meetings: to review actions of the General Conference from their regional perspectives, and to oversee the election and assignment of bishops. As you can see on the screen right now, the United States is divided into 5 jurisdictions. I'm going to now focus solely on the United States for the remainder of this presentation, as overseas Methodists have somewhat different structures that better reflect their cultures and their settings. We are part of the North Central jurisdiction, sharing our region with persons from the Dakotas east to Ohio. I'll talk more about annual conferences in a few moments, but right now I need to point out that our jurisdiction contains 10 such structures, 2 each in Ohio and Illinois, and 1 each for the states of Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. Due to our relatively low population numbers, the Dakotas are paired as a single annual conference. Now, during that jurisdictional conference, an election is held for any open positions for bishop. Such vacancies usually are created with the retirement or resignation of a bishop, but could also have occurred due to a death of such a person. When there are such openings, the delegates to a jurisdictional conference have the obligation or opportunity to elect an ordained elder from that region to such an episcopal position, as the bishop's role is often called. Then, the delegates approve a slate of persons to function as the jurisdiction's episcopal committee, whose role it is to determine which bishops will oversee which areas for the next 4 years. As bishops are elected within a particular region, they can only serve in that role within that specific jurisdiction. Elected in the North Central jurisdiction, serve in the North Central jurisdiction. And so we have gatherings every 4 years that tend to the overall administration of the denomination and the episcopal oversight for the jurisdictions. That then leads us to the next level of our structure, the annual conference. The term annual conference actually can be used to describe a gathering of delegates, a geographic region, or a semi-autonomous organization. Let me try to explain by using our local identity, the Dakotas Annual Conference, as an example. Typically held in June, the Dakotas Annual Conference brings together hundreds of persons for several days of workshops, business meetings, worship, and fellowship. All clergy appointed in the Dakotas are delegates to the annual conference, as are a similar number of laypersons. Each church or charge gets to select members of annual conference equal to the clergy by whom they are served. So we in St. Thomas get to send 1 layperson to annual conference to match my role as an elder. But since there are clergy who do not serve local churches and yet participate in annual conference, including district superintendents, conference staff, camp directors, seminary faculty, chaplains, and others, there are processes by which additional lay delegates can be selected to match the total number of clergy. Once gathered at the site, participants in the annual conference conduct business on matters expected for the efficient and effective administration of such organizations, including adoption of a budget for the following year, consideration of policy and other organizational changes, and approval of persons for licensing, commissioning, and ordination as clergy. The annual conference includes daily worship services and many opportunities for fellowship among persons from throughout the Dakotas. I sometimes say it's just like a family reunion. But the annual conference is not only a meeting, but also a term that designates a particular geographical area. As noted previously, the Dakotas are combined into one such region. As bishops are selected by jurisdiction and expected to serve in such role only in that area, so too are clergy ordained and appointed to service within a particular annual conference. A decision to allow a member of the clergy to serve in a different conference can only be made by the bishops of those two areas. One interesting note is that over the past 8 years, we've seen a number of clergy members move from the Dakotas into Minnesota, and some the opposite direction, because we have had Bishop O overseeing both annual conferences during that time, making it easy for him to approve such transfers. And finally, the annual conference is also an organization somewhat unto itself. It has its own staff, its own budget, and a good deal of ongoing flexibility to operate as its leaders see fit. And now would be a good time to bring up once again the role of district superintendent. As seen on the map, North and South Dakota, the Dakotas Annual Conference, is divided into 4 districts and named by their geographical arrangement. Thus, we are in the Northeast District, with Reverend Chris Mutzenberger serving as our district superintendent. She has somewhat of a dual role, assisting the bishop and conference staff with the business of the annual conference, while supervising and assisting the pastors and the congregations in the local churches of her district. The 4 district superintendents serve as the bishop's cabinet, with primary roles of advising the bishop, coordinating the work of the conference staff across the districts, and assisting in decisions related to the appointment of clergy each year. And that brings us to the level of the local church. The Book of Discipline lays out an expected structure for each congregation, but with considerable leeway in adapting to the needs and circumstances of their individual settings. That has become more so in recent years, as opposed to a more obligatory expectation in earlier times. The disciplinary structure looks something like that shown on the screen. The church conference has the ultimate local authority and typically consists of an annual meeting of all members of the congregation, during which time there's an election of officers, adoption of the next year's budget, approval of compensation for the pastor, receipt of a variety of reports from various committees and other groups, and discussion of the state of the church. That meeting typically is called to order and chaired by the district superintendent. Then, the day-to-day work of the church is overseen by a church council and a variety of subgroups. As seen on the screen, a typical council would have a dozen or more members, including the pastor. All of the lay members would have been elected at the annual church conference or appointed to fill vacancies that might arise during the year. Councils are expected to meet at least quarterly, but often do so on a monthly basis. In the typical council, shown again on the screen, you can see the various roles played by the members, from the pastor and council chair to secretary and treasurer, lay leader, and lay member of annual conference, to administrative committee chairs and persons who provide leadership for various other ministries and programs, including those for women, men, and youth. Now let's look at the administrative committees. The trustees hold legal ownership of the property of the local church in trust for the general church. And the trustees are responsible for all upkeep, maintenance, and repairs of such property. Decisions to purchase, sell, or upgrade church property typically begin with proposals from the trustees to the church council. Each congregation is expected to have a group whose responsibility is the oversight of the work of the pastor and any paid staff, usually called a pastor parish relations committee, or in a larger church, a staff parish relations committee. That group recommends compensation, engages in evaluation of performance, and mediates complaints against employees, even the pastor. In charges with more than one church, a joint committee assumes that responsibility, with membership sometimes evenly divided among the churches or allotted on the basis of membership. A finance committee has general oversight of the work of the church treasurer and financial secretary if such a paid position exists. That group is expected to develop a proposal for the annual budget to be given for review by the church council before presentation and adoption at the church conference. In addition, the Finance Committee often works with the pastor to develop a program for financial stewardship and an annual drive for pledges to support the next year's budget. Beyond such administrative bodies, local churches often have committees or other groups that oversee a variety of programs and ministries, from children and youth to Sunday school, vacation Bible school, and other educational programs. Other groups may have responsibilities for various mission activities, and yet others may become involved in evangelism, outreach, fellowship, membership, or worship. That's quite a complex structure, particularly for a small congregation such as ours in St. Thomas. But even larger churches have found such to be difficult, making it hard to recruit enough qualified persons to fill all the roles, or to offer a flexible, nimble ability to make decisions quickly at times. An example of a somewhat larger church with a radically different administrative structure is Wesley United Methodist Church in Grand Forks. A few years ago, outside consultants working with the church's leadership made recommendations to change the leadership structure of Wesley. The result is shown on the screen now. The number of persons on the newly named leadership team does not vary much from that of the disciplinary structure of a church council that we've been talking about. However, the big difference is the elimination of almost every other administrative body. No trustees, no SPRC, no finance committee, no program or ministry groups. Instead, one or two members of the leadership team have been given such responsibilities, going out and recruiting other persons to assist them when needed. So a dozen or so laypersons directly involved with the pastor, rather than the dozens who had to be recruited in previous years. Nimble, flexible, simple. But we have been given even a simpler structure here in St. Thomas. With so small a church, typically 20 to 30 persons in worship on Sunday mornings and membership of 40 to 50, there's not a need for so many work groups or meetings. Instead, we have a small group of persons who have dedicated a few years or more to serving the church with multiple responsibilities. The persons you see on the screen now, much simpler, much nimbler, and much more in keeping with the reality of the small church. And so we've come to the end of my presentation on the organization of the United Methodist Church, from its global general conference to the local church conference, from the hundreds of pages of detail in the Book of Discipline to the simplicity of a St. Thomas Church Council. I hope that this has served as an introduction to a pretty boring subject for those new to Methodism, as well as a refresher for others. Those who will be participating in our Zoom discussion on Wednesday have already received a set of handouts that accompany this topic. If you have not gotten such items but would like to have me email them to you, just send a request to the address shown now on the screen. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Your task now is to open yourself to the Holy Spirit's call. What might you do to assist your church and its work in the world? And now I invite you to join with me as we end this course in prayer. O Lord, pour out your blessing upon your servants who have been called to particular ministries in your church. Grant them grace to give themselves wholeheartedly to your service. Keep before them your example, who did not think first of himself but gave yourself for us all. Let those called to your service share in the joy of your ministry. Guide them in their work. Reward their faithfulness with the knowledge that through them your purposes are accomplished and your kingdom brought more fully into our world.